Ma'am, step away from your vehicle. Hands where I can see them. Agent Marcus Brennan's voice cut through the hospital parking lot at 7:42 a.m. Sharp, authoritative, final. Tamara Jenkins had just finished a 12-hour night shift in the ICU at St. Anthony Memorial Hospital in Phoenix. Her scrubs still smelled of antiseptic. Her feet ached. The morning sun was already brutal against the asphalt. She'd been thinking about her daughter's soccer practice, about the grocery run she needed to make, about sleep. She wasn't thinking about ice. I said, step away from the vehicle. Brennan moved closer, his hand resting on his duty belt. Behind him, Agent Jennifer Cole positioned herself near the rear of Jenkins' Honda Civic, blocking any retreat. Both agents wore tactical vests with ICE insignia clearly visible. Both had body cameras activated and recording. Jenkins' hands trembled as she raised them. "Officer, what's this about? I work here. I'm a nurse. We need to see identification and proof of legal status." Brennan's tone suggested this was routine, expected, non-negotiable. Proof of legal status? Jenkins' voice rose slightly. "I'm an American citizen. I was born in Detroit. Then proving it won't be a problem. Documentation. Now." The parking lot was filling with the morning shift arriving. Hospital employees slowed as they walked past, phones appearing in hands, recording the confrontation unfolding in the employee parking section. Jenkins could feel their stares. The humiliation burned hotter than the Arizona sun. Brennan had been with ICE for 8 years, working the Phoenix metro area with a reputation for aggressive enforcement. He'd participated in workplace raids, transportation sweeps, and what the agency called targeted operations. His personnel file contained 3 formal complaints alleging racial profiling. Each had been investigated and dismissed as unsubstantiated. His supervisors praised his proactive approach to immigration enforcement. What they meant was that Brennan made arrests based on instinct, on appearance, on assumptions about who belonged in America and who didn't. The tip had come in at 6:47 a.m. Anonymous caller. Female voice. Claimed there was an undocumented worker at St. Anthony Memorial using false credentials. No name provided, no specific description, no evidence. Just suspicion wrapped in bias and delivered through a phone call that couldn't be traced or verified. Standard procedure dictated that such tips be investigated before action, that agents verify information through databases and documentation before confrontation, that reasonable suspicion be established through more than anonymous accusations. Brennan skipped those steps. He'd been parked outside the hospital since 7:15 a.m., watching employees exit after the night shift, watching for someone who fit his internal profile of suspicious. When Jenkins walked out, her dark skin, her tired posture, something in Brennan's mind clicked. Target. Identified. "My wallet is in my purse in the car," Jenkins said, her voice steadying despite the fear crawling up her spine. "I can show you my driver's license, my nursing license, my hospital ID. Everything you need to verify I'm exactly who I say I am." "Step away from the vehicle," Brennan repeated. His body camera recorded Jenkins' face clearly, the confusion, the anger beginning to surface beneath the shock. "You'll be given the opportunity to provide documentation at the processing center." Processing center? Jenkins' professional training kicked in, the years of dealing with difficult patients and high-pressure situations. "Officer, I have rights. You can't just detain me without probable cause. I'm an American citizen. I was born in Detroit on March 23, 1984. I've worked at this hospital for 7 years. I have a daughter waiting for me at home. Ma'am, if you continue to resist, this becomes obstruction." Cole spoke for the first time, her body camera capturing a different angle of Jenkins' growing distress. "We have authority to verify immigration status. You're making this more difficult than it needs to be." The irony wasn't lost on Jenkins. She'd spent the last 12 hours saving lives. A cardiac arrest at 9 p.m., a stroke victim at 2 a.m., a teenager in diabetic ketoacidosis at 5 a.m. She'd held hands with frightened patients, explained complex medical procedures in simple terms, provided comfort in moments of crisis. Now she was being treated like a criminal in the parking lot of her own workplace. A hospital security guard approached, drawn by the commotion. "Tamara, is everything okay?" He knew her. Had worked the night shift security desk for 5 years. Had seen her save more lives than he could count. "Sir, step back. This is federal business." Brennan's hand moved to his handcuffs. Final warning, ma'am. Hands behind your back. You're arresting me? Jenkins' voice cracked. For what? For being black and leaving work? For not carrying my birth certificate to a 12-hour shift? This is racial profiling. Brennan's jaw tightened. His body camera recorded the moment, the decision point. He could de-escalate, could request Jenkins retrieve her identification from her vehicle, could run her name through databases while she waited, could verify her citizenship in 5 minutes through standard procedures. Instead, he grabbed her wrist. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed across the parking lot. The security guard pulled out his phone, recording. 3 nurses in the distance stopped walking, their phones also raised. Jenkins' professional composure shattered. She began to cry, not from pain, but from the soul-crushing humiliation of being detained like a criminal while wearing scrubs that still carried the weight of the lives she'd fought to save. Cole retrieved Jenkins' purse from the vehicle while Brennan held her by the arm. Inside the purse, a Michigan driver's license showing Tamara Marie Jenkins, born March 23, 1984, Detroit, Michigan. A U.S. passport, an Arizona nursing license, a hospital employee ID with 7 years of security clearance documentation, a social security card, everything an American citizen would carry. Brennan barely glanced at the documents. We'll verify these at the facility. Could be fake. They're not fake, Jenkins said, her voice hollow. They're real. I'm real. I'm American. And you're destroying my life because you looked at me and decided I didn't belong here. The walk to the ice van felt eternal. Every step captured on body camera. Every moment of Jenkins' humiliation documented in high-definition video. She was placed in the back of the van at 7:58 a.m., 16 minutes after Brennan first called out to her. What neither agent realized as they drove away from St. Anthony Memorial Hospital was that their body cameras had recorded everything, every violation of protocol, every dismissal of Jenkins' documentation, every moment of an American citizen being detained based on nothing more than the color of her skin. And those recordings would eventually cost the federal government $12.6 million. The Eloy Detention Center sat 90 minutes south of Phoenix, a sprawling concrete facility surrounded by chain-link fence and razor wire. Tamara Jenkins arrived at 9:34 a.m., still wearing her hospital scrubs, still handcuffed, still trying to process what was happening to her. The intake process was methodical, dehumanizing, designed to strip away identity and replace it with a number. Agent Brennan's body camera captured the initial processing, Jenkins standing before a desk, an intake officer asking questions in a monotone that suggested he'd asked these same questions thousands of times before. Name, Tamara Marie Jenkins. Date of birth, March 23, 1984. Place of birth, Detroit, Michigan. I'm an American citizen. I've told your agents this repeatedly. The intake officer's fingers paused over his keyboard. He looked up at Brennan. She claims U.S. citizenship, claims, as if Jenkins' birthright was a lie she'd invented in the parking lot. She had identification, Brennan said, his body camera recording his own dismissive shrug. Driver's license, passport, could be fraudulent. We're running verification, the intake officer typed. His screen showed databases connecting, searches executing, Social Security Administration, Department of State passport records, Arizona Department of Motor Vehicles, Michigan Vital Statistics. Every database came back with the same answer. Tamara Marie Jenkins, U.S. citizen, born Detroit, Michigan, March 23, 1984. The intake officer's expression changed, subtle, but captured clearly on Cole's body camera from her position near the door. Concern. Recognition that something had gone very wrong. Agent Brennan, her documentation appears valid. All databases confirm U.S. citizenship. Social Security number matches. Passport is authentic. No immigration holds, no deportation orders. She's American. Brennan stepped closer to a monitor, his body camera recording the screen, though the angle made details difficult to read. Run a deeper check. Sometimes these records are manipulated. I already ran the deeper check. The intake officer's voice took on an edge. There's nothing here. She's a U.S. citizen with no criminal record. She shouldn't be here. Cole shifted uncomfortably, her camera capturing her own feet. She'd been with ICE for 3 years, had participated in legitimate deportations of individuals with criminal records and active removal orders, had never been part of detaining an American citizen who'd done nothing wrong. "We had reasonable suspicion based on the tip," Cole said, but her voice lacked conviction. "What tip?" The intake officer looked between the two agents. "What specific information justified this detention?" Silence. Captured on 3 separate body cameras, the audio picking up only the hum of fluorescent lights and distant voices from other parts of the facility. Anonymous complaint about hospital employees, Brennan finally said. Reasonable suspicion of immigration violations. Based on what evidence? More silence. Jenkins spoke, her voice controlled, despite the tears streaming down her face. Based on the fact that I'm black. That's your evidence. You saw me leaving work and decided I looked suspicious. That's racial profiling, and you know it. The intake officer closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he was looking at Brennan with barely concealed anger. You detained a U.S. citizen without probable cause. You ignored valid documentation. And now she's in federal custody based on nothing but an anonymous tip with no specifics. We followed protocol, Brennan insisted. His body camera recorded him crossing his arms defensively. Protocol requires verification before detention. Protocol requires probable cause. You bypassed both. The intake officer turned to Jenkins. Ms. Jenkins, I apologize for this error. You'll be released immediately. Released? Jenkins' voice rose. I've been handcuffed, detained, transported 90 minutes from my home, processed like a criminal. And you think released immediately makes this okay? The intake officer had no answer. He began typing rapidly, documenting the release, covering himself and the facility from liability for a detention that should never have happened. But released immediately proved optimistic. The bureaucracy of detention moves slowly. Forms required signatures. Supervisors needed notification. Chain of custody documentation demanded completion. Jenkins sat in a holding cell for 3 hours while paperwork processed. 3 hours sitting on a concrete bench, still wearing her scrubs, still smelling the hospital antiseptic, thinking about her daughter, who'd be getting out of school, wondering where her mother was. Her phone had been confiscated during intake. Her one call, made at 10:47 a.m., went to her sister. Lisa? Jenkins' voice cracked. I've been arrested by ICE. I'm at Eloy Detention Center. I need you to call a lawyer, please. They grabbed me leaving work. I'm American. You know I'm American. But they didn't care. Her sister's scream was loud enough to be picked up by the phone system's recording. What? Tamara, what are you talking about? You were born in Detroit. I know. I showed them my passport. They said it might be fake. Lisa, I'm scared. I don't know what's happening. The call ended after 6 minutes. Jenkins returned to the holding cell, sat on the concrete bench, waited. What she didn't know was that her sister immediately called the ACLU, that civil rights attorneys were already gathering information, that the hospital security guard's video was already being shared on social media, that 3 nurses who had witnessed the parking lot detention were already contacting news stations. At 1:23 p.m., Jenkins was finally processed for release. The facility's own cameras captured her walking out, 6 hours after she'd been detained. Her scrubs were wrinkled, her eyes were red. Her hands shook as she signed the release papers. A facility supervisor approached her as she prepared to leave. Ms. Jenkins, we apologize for this incident. There was clearly a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? Jenkins stared at him. I was detained for 6 hours despite being an American citizen with valid documentation. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a civil rights violation. The supervisor had no response. His facility's cameras captured him, looking away, unable to meet her eyes. Jenkins' sister picked her up at 2:17 p.m. The drive back to Phoenix was silent, except for Jenkins' occasional tears. She couldn't articulate the violation she felt, the fundamental betrayal of being treated as suspect in her own country. When she finally arrived home at 3:48 p.m., her daughter ran to her. Mommy, where were you? I was worried. Jenkins held her daughter and cried, couldn't explain, couldn't find words for what had happened. That night she tried to sleep, couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Brennan's face, heard the handcuffs clicking, felt the humiliation of being detained in front of her colleagues. At 2:34 a.m., she gave up on sleep, sat at her kitchen table, Googled wrongful ICE detention, found hundreds of cases. American citizens detained for hours, days, weeks, some for years. People who'd been born in the United States, served in the military, raised families, built lives, all detained because agents decided their documentation wasn't sufficient, their citizenship was questionable, their presence was suspicious. She found the name of a civil rights attorney, Maria Santos, specialized in immigration detention cases. Jenkins sent an email at 3:47 a.m. Subject: wrongfully detained by ICE, despite being U.S. citizen body. I need help. Yesterday morning, ICE agents detained me in my hospital parking lot after I finished my shift as an ICU nurse. I showed them my passport, driver's license, and nursing license. They said my documents might be fake and detained me anyway. I was held for 6 hours at Eloy Detention Center before being released. I am an American citizen. I was born in Detroit, Michigan. I have never committed a crime, and I was treated like a criminal because of the color of my skin. Please help me. This can't be legal. Santos responded at 7:12 a.m. Subject: R.E. wrongfully detained by ICE despite being U.S. citizen body. Ms. Jenkins, I'm sorry this happened to you. What ICE did was illegal. The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable seizures. Being detained without probable cause violates your constitutional rights. Please call my office immediately. We need to file a Federal Tort Claims Act notice before the statute of limitations runs. This case matters, not just for you, but for every American citizen who might face the same violation. Let's hold them accountable. Jenkins called at 7:43 a.m. The lawyer listened to her story, asked pointed questions, requested documentation, and then said the words that would change everything. Ms. Jenkins, they recorded everything on body cameras, which means we have evidence of every violation, every moment they ignored your documentation, every second of your constitutional rights being trampled. This isn't just a lawsuit. This is a case that could force ICE to change how they operate. The fight for justice had begun. Attorney Maria Santos had built her career on David versus Goliath cases, representing individuals crushed by government agencies with unlimited resources and qualified immunity shields. She'd won settlements, forced policy changes, held federal agents accountable when others said it couldn't be done. But when she reviewed the body camera footage from Tamara Jenkins' detention, even Santos felt her stomach turn. The footage was damning, crystal clear, irrefutable. Brennan's body camera showed him targeting Jenkins with zero probable cause, showed him dismissing her valid passport as potentially fraudulent, showed him handcuffing an American citizen who'd committed no crime. Cole's camera captured Jenkins' distress from a different angle, the tears, the professional composure cracking under institutional assault. The intake footage showed the moment the facility officer confirmed Jenkins' citizenship, showed Brennan's refusal to accept database verification, showed his insistence on deeper checks despite having no legal basis to detain her even one more second. This is a Fourth Amendment violation so clear that any reasonable agent would know they were breaking the law, Santos told Jenkins during their second meeting, which means qualified immunity won't protect them. Jenkins sat in Santos's office, still processing what had happened 4 days earlier. Can you explain what that means? The legal part. I just want to understand what my options are. Santos pulled out a notepad, began sketching the legal landscape. The Federal Tort Claims Act allows you to sue the federal government for wrongful acts committed by their employees. That's the mechanism we'll use. But here's the critical part. When federal agents violate clearly established constitutional rights, they can be held personally liable. And when the government enables that violation through systemic failures, they can be held institutionally liable. What kind of systemic failures? Santos had already filed Freedom of Information Act requests for Brennan's personnel file, training records, and complaint history. What she'd received made the case even stronger. Agent Brennan has 3 formal complaints in his file alleging racial profiling. All were investigated and dismissed. But when you read the complaints, they all describe the same pattern: targeting people of color, demanding papers without probable cause, ignoring valid documentation. ICE knew he had this pattern. They did nothing meaningful to stop it. Jenkins absorbed this. So they knew he was doing this? They knew, and they let him keep doing it. That's deliberate. Indifference. That's the government creating the conditions for constitutional violations. Santos filed the Federal Tort Claims Act notice on day 6. The administrative claim was required before any lawsuit could proceed. It documented Jenkins' detention, the violation of her Fourth Amendment rights, the racial profiling, the emotional and professional harm. Damages sought, $15 million. Compensatory damages for unlawful detention, emotional distress, reputational harm, and violation of constitutional rights. $8 million punitive damages to punish the government for deliberate indifference and forced policy change. $7 million. The government had 6 months to investigate and respond. Santos didn't wait. She began building the case. She obtained the hospital security camera footage showing the parking lot detention, multiple angles of Jenkins being handcuffed while wearing scrubs, witnesses recording on phones, the security guard trying to intervene. She obtained statements from the AOZ, 3 nurses who'd witnessed the detention. All described shock at seeing their colleague treated like a criminal. All confirmed Jenkins had committed no offense, done nothing suspicious, simply walked to her car after a 12-hour shift saving lives. She obtained Jenkins' personnel file from St. Anthony Memorial. 7 years of exemplary performance reviews. Commendations from patients and families. Awards for excellence in nursing care. A woman who dedicated her career to healing, detained like a threat. She obtained Jenkins' medical records from the days following detention. Diagnosed with acute stress reaction and PTSD. Prescribed anti-anxiety medication. Referred to trauma counseling. The psychological documentation of what happens when an American citizen is detained in their own country for the crime of being black. But the most powerful evidence came from Santos's investigation into ICE's practices. Using public records requests and statistical analysis, Santos obtained data on ICE detentions in the Phoenix area over the previous 3 years. The numbers told a story that was impossible to ignore. Agent Brennan had conducted 47 street-level detentions during that period. 43 involved people of color. 38 of those detained were later confirmed to be U.S. citizens or legal residents. Of the remaining 9 deportations that proceeded, 7 were overturned on appeal due to procedural violations. The statistical analysis was devastating. Brennan wasn't enforcing immigration law. He was racially profiling with a badge and federal authority. Santos contacted the other victims, found 12 willing to provide statements. Read their stories, each one a variation of Jenkins' nightmare. A man detained at a bus stop despite showing his driver's license and military ID. A woman detained at a grocery store despite showing her birth certificate and social security card. A teenager detained walking home from school despite being born in Phoenix. Every victim was a person of color. Every victim had provided valid documentation. Every victim was detained anyway. Santos compiled the pattern into a comprehensive legal brief. This wasn't about one bad agent having one bad day. This was systemic, institutional, a pattern of constitutional violations enabled by inadequate training, insufficient oversight, and deliberate indifference to civil rights. The government's response came 5 months and 3 weeks after Santos filed the administrative claim, a form letter denying liability, claiming Brennan had acted within the scope of his authority based on reasonable suspicion from an anonymous tip, asserting qualified immunity, offering no apology or accountability. Santos smiled when she read the denial. They'd made it easy. She filed the federal lawsuit the next morning. Tamara Jenkins v. United States of America, Marcus Brennan, Jennifer Cole. The complaint was 147 pages. It included every body camera frame showing Jenkins, valid documentation being dismissed, every statistical analysis proving racial profiling, every victim statement demonstrating pattern and practice, every medical record documenting trauma, every piece of evidence showing that ICE had violated the constitutional rights of an American citizen. The media response was immediate. Local news picked up the story first. Black nurse detained by ICE despite being U.S. citizen. National outlets followed: CNN, NBC, The Washington Post. The story had everything: and sympathetic victim, clear injustice, video evidence, a system failing the people it was supposed to protect. Jenkins gave her first interview 2 weeks after filing, sat across from a journalist, and told her story with remarkable composure. "I spent 12 hours saving lives," she said, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "I had patients who lived because I was there, and then I walked to my car and was treated like a criminal, not because I'd done anything wrong, but because agents looked at me and decided I didn't belong. That's not immigration enforcement. That's racism with federal authority." The interview went viral, shared millions of times, comment sections filled with outrage and support. but also with the predictable defense. If she had nothing to hide, why not just cooperate? Santos addressed that narrative in a press conference. Tamara Jenkins had nothing to hide. She provided her passport, her driver's license, her nursing license. She explained she was American. She did everything right, and she was still detained, because when you're black in America, proving your citizenship isn't always enough. The legal battle was just beginning, but the court of public opinion had already reached its verdict. ICE had violated an American citizen's rights, and the evidence was captured on their own cameras. 18 months after Tamara Jenkins' detention, the case went to trial in U.S. District Court for the District of Arizona. The government fought hard to avoid this moment. 3 settlement offers. First, $200,000 and no admission of wrongdoing, refused. Second, $850,000 and policy changes, refused. Third, $3.2 million in agent discipline, refused. This isn't about money, Santos told Jenkins after rejecting the final offer. This is about making sure every ICE agent knows they can't do this, about changing the system that made your detention possible. The trial lasted 3 weeks, the courtroom packed every day with civil rights advocates, immigrant rights organizations, nurses from St. Anthony Memorial wearing their scrubs in solidarity, and media from across the country. The jury, 12 Arizonans of diverse backgrounds. 3 had law enforcement in their families. 2 were immigrants who'd become citizens. 4 were parents of school-aged children. All had watched the pre-trial. Publicity. All had been instructed to decide based solely on evidence presented in court. Santos's opening statement was direct. Members of the jury, you're going to see body camera footage from 3 different angles showing a United States citizen being detained without probable cause. You'll see Agent Brennan dismiss a valid U.S. passport as fake. You'll see him handcuff a nurse in her hospital parking lot after a 12-hour shift. You'll hear his own admission that he had no evidence beyond an anonymous tip with 0 specifics. And you'll see the pattern. 47 detentions over 3 years, 43 involving people of color, 38 who were American citizens. This isn't immigration enforcement. This is racial profiling. And it violated Tamara Jenkins' Fourth Amendment rights. The government's attorney was Jennifer Walsh, a veteran DOJ litigator who defended dozens of federal law enforcement cases. Her opening was calculated. Ladies and gentlemen, ICE agents face difficult situations every day. They receive tips, they investigate, they make judgment calls in real time. Agent Brennan received a tip about potential immigration violations at a hospital. He approached Ms. Jenkins to verify her status, which is within his authority. When presented with documentation, he followed protocol by bringing her to a facility for database verification. Yes, Ms. Jenkins was inconvenienced, but inconvenience isn't constitutional violation, and agents must have discretion to enforce immigration law. The body camera footage was played on day 2. 3 screens positioned around the courtroom, showing Brennan's perspective, Cole's perspective, and the facility intake simultaneously. The courtroom went silent as the footage rolled. Jurors watched Jenkins raise her hands in the parking lot, confusion and fear crossing her face. They heard Brennan demand proof of legal status. They watched Jenkins explain she was American, offer her documentation, plead for basic respect. They saw the passport. Clear on Brennan's body camera, United States of America emblazoned across the cover. Jenkins' photo, her birthplace listed as Detroit, Michigan, valid through 2029. They heard Brennan dismiss it, could be fraudulent. They watched the handcuffs click. The walk to the van, Jenkins crying. They saw the intake officer's screen confirming citizenship, watched Brennan demand deeper checks despite having no legal basis. When the footage ended, 3 jurors were crying, others looked angry. One elderly man in the back row shook his head repeatedly. Santos let the silence hold for 10 seconds before speaking. That's what a constitutional violation looks like. Jenkins testified on day 4. Walked the jury through her life. Born in Detroit to parents who'd both been born in Ohio. Graduated high school with honors, nursing degree from Wayne State University. 7 years at St. Anthony Memorial, mother to a 10-year-old daughter. Tell the jury about your shift. That night, Santos said gently. Jenkins took a breath. We had 3 code blues. That's when a patient's heart stops. We lost 1, saved 2. I held a woman's hand while she died, because her family couldn't get there in time. I explained to a teenager why his diabetes diagnosis meant his life would change. I showed a new mother how to nurse her premature baby. And then I walked to my car thinking about my daughter's soccer practice. What happened when you reached your car? Jenkins' voice shook. Agent Brennan demanded to see proof I was legal, not proof I'd committed a crime. Proof I was legal. Like my existence in America was questionable. Like being black in a parking lot required justification. How did that make you feel? I felt terrified. I felt humiliated. I'd spent 12 hours saving lives, and suddenly I'm being treated like I don't belong in my own country. She paused, tears streaming. I was born here. My parents were born here. My daughter was born here. But none of that mattered to Agent Brennan because he looked at me and decided I was suspicious. Under cross-examination, Walsh tried to establish that Jenkins had been uncooperative. Isn't it true you argued with Agent Brennan? I asserted my rights. There's a difference. You raised your voice. I was being detained without cause. Yes, I was upset. Did you immediately comply with requests? I showed him my passport immediately. What else was I supposed to do? Carry my birth certificate to work? The exchange went on for an hour, Walsh trying to paint Jenkins as difficult. Santos objecting repeatedly. The jury watching a black woman explain that asserting constitutional rights isn't resistance. Brennan testified on day 9. His appearance carefully managed by government attorneys. Clean uniform, composed demeanor, rehearsed answers. Santos cross-examined. Agent Brennan, what specific information in the anonymous tip gave you probable cause to detain Ms. Jenkins? The tip indicated undocumented workers at the hospital. Did it name Ms. Jenkins? No. Did it describe what she looked like? No. Did it specify which department, which shift, which entrance? No. So, you had an anonymous tip with no specifics. How did you determine Ms. Jenkins was the person to detain? Brennan hesitated, the pause captured by courtroom recording. She was exiting the hospital. The timing matched. The hospital has 600 employees. How many were exiting that morning? I don't know. How many did you observe exiting? Maybe 20. How many did you detain? 1. Ms. Jenkins, a black woman. While 19 others walked to their cars without being stopped. Santos paused. Agent Brennan, what made Ms. Jenkins specifically suspicious? Silence. Was it her scrubs, her hospital ID, the fact that she was walking to her car? More silence. Or was it the color of her skin? Objection. Walsh was on her feet, argumentative. Sustained, the judge said. But Ms. Santos, continue. Agent Brennan, your personnel file shows 3 complaints for racial profiling, all dismissed. But in those complaints, citizens described you targeting people of color, demanding papers, ignoring documentation. Isn't that exactly what you did to Ms. Jenkins? Those complaints were unsubstantiated, because they were your word against victims who had no video evidence. But this time, your own body camera recorded everything, and it shows you did exactly what those complaints alleged. The statistical expert testified on day 12. Dr. Raymond Cole, professor of criminal justice at Arizona State University. He'd analyzed Brennan's detention patterns. Of Agent Brennan's 47 street-level detentions over 3 years, 43 involved people of color. That's 91.5%. The Phoenix metro area where he operated is 43% non-white, according to census data. If detentions were race-neutral, we'd expect roughly 43% to involve people of color, not 91.5%. This disparity is statistically significant beyond any reasonable doubt. Walsh, cross-examined. Couldn't this be explained by the neighborhoods Agent Brennan was assigned? I analyzed for that. Even controlling for neighborhood demographics, assignment patterns, and time of day, the racial disparity in his detentions is statistically impossible to explain by anything other than selective enforcement. The medical expert testified on day 14, Dr. Sarah Williams, trauma psychologist. She'd treated Jenkins after the detention. Ms. Jenkins presents with classic PTSD symptoms stemming from the detention. Nightmares, hypervigilance, anxiety in public spaces. She's afraid to go to work, afraid to leave her house. The trauma isn't just from being detained. It's from the fundamental betrayal of having her citizenship questioned in her own country. The closing arguments came on day 17. Santos stood before the jury, her voice carrying the weight of every wrongful detention, every constitutional violation, every American citizen treated as suspect. The evidence is clear. Agent Brennan detained Tamara Jenkins without probable cause. He ignored her valid U.S. passport. He handcuffed her based solely on an anonymous tip and his own racial bias. The Fourth Amendment exists to prevent exactly this. And when federal agents violated this flagrantly, there must be consequences, Walsh countered. ICE agents make difficult decisions in challenging circumstances. Agent Brennan acted on a tip, followed procedure, and released Ms. Jenkins when verification was complete. Disagreement with his judgment isn't the same as constitutional violation. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On the afternoon of the third day, they returned. Verdict: liable on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Jenkins sobbed into Santos's shoulder. Brennan sat stone-faced. The judge gavelled for order. The damages phase took another week. The jury heard about Jenkins' ongoing trauma, her lost wages, her medical expenses, her daughter's fear. When they announced the damages, the courtroom went silent. $4.1 million in compensatory damages, $8.5 million in punitive damages, total $12.6 million. Justice, when it arrives, sounds like numbers. But behind those numbers was a message that echoed across every ICE field office in America. American citizenship means something. Constitutional rights matter. And racial profiling will cost you. The verdict landed like a bomb in ICE headquarters. $12.6 million. The largest civil rights judgment against immigration enforcement in agency history. A black nurse detained for 6 hours despite valid documentation. Body camera footage showing every violation. A jury's unmistakable message: this stops now. Within 24 hours, Acting ICE Director Sarah Mitchell convened an emergency meeting with field office supervisors nationwide. The memo was unambiguous. Review all detention procedures, mandatory retraining on Fourth Amendment compliance, immediate investigation of any pending cases involving U.S. citizens. The real changes ran deeper. Agent Marcus Brennan was terminated 72 hours after the verdict. His personnel file, once protected by agency loyalty, was forwarded to the Department of Justice Office of Inspector General for Criminal Investigation. The 3 complaints that had been dismissed as unsubstantiated were reopened. The pattern Santos had exposed wasn't just civil liability, it was potential criminal misconduct. Agent Jennifer Cole received a 30-day suspension and mandatory retraining. She hadn't initiated the detention, but she'd participated, enabled it, failed to intervene when she knew it was wrong. The suspension sent a message: witnessing constitutional violations without acting makes you complicit. But individual accountability was only the beginning. The verdict forced systemic reform. ICE implemented new mandatory verification protocols. Before any detention based on anonymous tips, agents must conduct database checks confirming reasonable suspicion of immigration violations. Before questioning anyone's citizenship status, agents must articulate specific facts beyond appearance or location. Before dismissing valid U.S. documentation as potentially fraudulent, agents must obtain supervisor approval and forensic verification. The body camera policy changed. All footage from citizenship verification stops must be flagged for supervisor review within 48 hours. Quarterly audits examining racial demographics of stops became mandatory. Any pattern showing disproportionate targeting triggers automatic investigation. Training curriculum was overhauled. New modules on Fourth Amendment rights, implicit bias recognition, and de-escalation techniques became required annually. The Jenkins case became a training video shown to every agent with the title, "Constitutional Violations Cost $12.6 million. But policy changes on paper mean nothing without enforcement. 3 field office supervisors who dismissed complaints against Brennan were reassigned to desk positions. The message was clear. Protecting bad agents makes you liable. For Tamara Jenkins, the verdict brought vindication, but not peace. The $12.6 million settlement was structured over time. Immediate payment of $4 million for past damages. Remaining $8.6 million in structured payments over 15 years, ensuring long-term financial security. She used the initial payment to establish the Jenkins Civil Rights Defense Fund, providing free legal representation to others wrongfully detained by immigration authorities. Within 6 months, the fund had taken on 14 cases. 3 involved American citizens detained despite documentation. 8 involved legal residents with valid papers. 2 involved asylum seekers detained in violation of international law. Every case won. Every case citing Jenkins versus the United States as precedent. Jenkins never returned to nursing at St. Anthony Memorial. The parking lot held too many ghosts. The trauma of being detained where she'd saved lives proved insurmountable. Instead, she became an advocate, testified before Congress about ICE accountability, spoke at law schools about constitutional rights, shared her story with anyone who'd listen. Her congressional testimony, delivered 9 months after the verdict, was covered by every major network. She sat before the House Judiciary Committee wearing the same scrubs she'd worn the day of her detention, now preserved as evidence and symbol. "I want you to understand what it feels like," she told the committee, her voice steady despite tears, "to be an American citizen treated like you don't belong in your own country, to show your passport and be told it might be fake, to be handcuffed in front of your colleagues for the crime of being black and leaving work. The Fourth Amendment says I have the right to be free from unreasonable seizure, but Agent Brennan decided my skin color was reasonable suspicion. That's not law enforcement. That's legalized racism." The testimony went viral, shared millions of times, used in classrooms teaching constitutional law, cited in subsequent civil rights lawsuits. But the most profound impact came from the 12 Americans who'd served on her jury. After the verdict, several jurors spoke to media about their deliberations. The foreman, a retired high school teacher named Robert Martinez, explained their thinking. "We saw the body camera footage. We heard Agent Brennan admit he had no specific evidence. We looked at the statistics showing he targeted people of color. The law was clear. The violation was obvious. The only question was damages. Why $12.6 million? Because $12.6 million gets attention," Martinez said. "It makes every ICE agent think twice before demanding papers from American citizens. It sends a message that constitutional rights matter more than agency convenience." Ms. Jenkins suffered, yes, but the punitive damages weren't about her suffering. They were about preventing the next Tamara Jenkins from being detained. That interview was shared across law enforcement training academies, jurors explaining in plain language why racial profiling carries massive liability. 1 year after the verdict, Jenkins received an unexpected letter from a woman named Maria Gonzalez in Texas. The letter explained that Gonzalez had been detained by ICE despite being born in San Antonio, held for 3 days, missed her mother's funeral, lost her job. But after reading about Jenkins' case, Gonzalez had found a lawyer, had sued using the same legal theories, had won a $3.8 million settlement. "Your courage gave me courage," the letter read. "Your willingness to fight back showed me that we don't have to accept this. Thank you for being strong when it mattered." Jenkins kept that letter framed in her office. Reminder that justice isn't just about individual cases, it's about creating precedent for others. 2 years after the verdict, the Government Accountability Office released a comprehensive report on ICE detention practices. The study examined 50,000 detentions over 5 years. The findings confirmed what Jenkins' case had exposed. Racial disparities in street-level immigration enforcement were systematic and statistically significant. The report recommended exactly the reforms IC had implemented post-Jenkins, validating that the verdict had forced necessary change. Congressional hearings followed. Legislation was proposed requiring annual reporting on citizenship verification stops, demographic analysis of detention patterns, and independent oversight of immigration enforcement. The Jenkins case became the catalyst for broader reform. But for Jenkins herself, the victory came with permanent scars. The PTSD never fully resolved. Crowded parking lots triggered panic attacks. The sight of ICE vehicles caused physical reactions. Her daughter, now 12, had developed her own anxiety about law enforcement. Jenkins spoke openly about this in interviews. She refused to pretend the verdict erased the trauma. "People think winning means everything goes back to normal," she told NPR in an interview. "But I'll never feel completely safe again. I'll never look at my passport without remembering an agent dismissing it as fake. The money doesn't heal that. It just prevents financial ruin on top of emotional devastation." That honesty resonated. Comments on the interview filled with others sharing similar experiences. American citizens questioned at borders, in airports, in their own communities. People who'd spent years proving citizenship, despite being born in the United States. The Jenkins case gave voice to experiences that had been dismissed as isolated incidents, revealed them as patterns, made them visible. 3 years after the verdict, Jenkins published a memoir, Detained: How ICE Arrested an American Nurse and What It Taught Me About Justice. The book became a bestseller, assigned reading in civil rights law classes nationwide. In the final chapter, she wrote, "The $12.6 million doesn't define my victory. The policy changes matter more than money. Knowing that Agent Brennan can't do this to anyone else, that ICE must verify before detaining, that constitutional rights have teeth, that's the real win. But the deepest victory is personal. I refuse to disappear quietly. I refuse to accept that being black means proving your citizenship is never enough. I fought back, and I won. Not just for me, for every American who will never be detained because a jury said, enough." The book tour took her across the country, standing room-only crowds at bookstores and universities, questions from audience members who'd faced similar violations, parents asking how to protect their children, students wanting to become civil rights attorneys. Jenkins answered every question with characteristic directness. She didn't sugarcoat the trauma, didn't pretend the verdict solved systemic racism. But she emphasized the power of holding institutions accountable. "One thing I learned," she told audiences, "is that change happens when people refuse to accept injustice, when they document violations, when they find lawyers willing to fight, when juries hold government accountable. The system protects itself until citizens force it to change." 5 years after her detention, Jenkins stood in the same parking lot where Brennan had handcuffed her. St. Anthony Memorial Hospital had invited her for a ceremony dedicating a new patient advocacy center in her name. Standing where she'd been detained, surrounded by colleagues who'd witnessed her humiliation, Jenkins spoke to the assembled crowd. "This parking lot will always be complicated for me. It's where I experienced one of the worst violations of my life. But it's also where I found my purpose. Agent Brennan thought he could detain me and I'd disappear. Instead, I fought back. And that fight changed policy, created precedent, and showed every American that constitutional rights matter." The crowd applauded. Among them, 3 of the jurors from her trial, the hospital security guard who'd tried to intervene, the nurses who'd recorded the detention on their phones, all witnesses to violation who'd become witnesses for justice. The final word belongs to the verdict itself, preserved in federal court records. A jury's unanimous conclusion that an American citizen's Fourth Amendment rights had been violated, that racial profiling by federal agents would not be tolerated, that justice, when it arrives, carries a price tag calculated to force change. $12.6 million. Not just compensation, a message. Agent Marcus Brennan saw a black woman leaving work and decided she looked suspicious. He demanded papers she had no obligation to provide. He dismissed her valid documentation. He detained her for 6 hours despite knowing she was American. And it cost the federal government $12.6 million. That's the price of constitutional violations. That's the cost of racial profiling. That's what happens when citizens fight back. And that's how one nurse's courage changed immigration enforcement in America.